Welcome to Heart Talk. I'm Graziano Marcheski, and we're here at the Pastoral Center of the Diocese of Springfield in Illinois to have a heart-to-heart conversation with their shepherd, Bishop Thomas Paprocki. Well, Bishop, it's a delight to be here.
Thank you.
If I were as Polish as my name sounds, would I say Bishop Paprocki?
Well, yes, you would. That would be the correct way to say it in Polish. Now, my great-grandparents came from Poland in the 1890s. So I'm fourth generation. And somewhere along the line, I think it was my grandparents that, my grandfather who had a drugstore on the south side of Chicago, was Paprocki Pharmacy. So we Americanized it, but Polish people always tell me that it's the proper pronunciation of Paprocki.
Great. So you are from a large family, aren't you? You're the third of 9 children, mostly boys.
Yes, 7 boys. The oldest is a girl and the youngest is a girl, and 7 boys in between.
Should we be feeling sorry for those 2 girls?
No, I think we treated them pretty well.
That's great to hear.
I hope they would say so.
Well, tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up on the south side of Chicago in such a large family.
Well, my father was also a pharmacist, and he took over the family business after my grandfather died. So we had an apartment building at Cermak and Sacramento on the south side of Chicago. And we lived, initially, when we were smaller, first starting out, we lived behind the pharmacy. And then as the family grew, we moved it up to the 2nd floor. And we wound up expanding, taking over apartments until we wound up having an 11-room apartment.
Oh, my gosh.
On the 2nd floor of this apartment building above the drugstore. So we literally lived above the store. And so I worked in the drugstore when, I think I started when I was in 6th grade, and started working behind the candy counter selling candy. And then playing, just having so many brothers, there was always somebody to play with. So we would play. We had a long, narrow basement under the pharmacy, and we would go down there and play floor hockey and just have a lot of fun together. So it was great being from a big family. And then we were a block away from the parish church, and so that was a big part of our lives.
I know a good bit of your background, but I'm sure that most of our listeners have no idea what a varied background, what an eclectic human being you are. You mentioned playing floor hockey in the basement of your dad's drugstore, but it didn't stop there, did it? Hockey's been an important part of your life for a lot of years.
Oh, it has been a very important part. Actually, so I started out playing floor hockey and then some roller hockey because there wasn't an ice rink nearby. And I didn't learn how to ice skate till I was a seminarian at Mundelein Seminary. And I used to, my first winter there, the lake froze over, and I'd go out on the lake and taught myself how to skate. And then I started playing ice hockey. So for me, it's always been, men's league and just, for fun. So, hockey's been a big part of my life and sports.
And people have taken notice. U.S. Hockey Magazine even had a cover story with a fascinating title, Holy Goalie.
Well, yeah, that was a nickname given to me by a parishioner some years ago. They started calling me the Holy Goalie. And
saving goals as well as souls.
Saving goals and souls, yeah. So they had a nice story in USA Hockey Magazine that featured me, and that had a ripple effect, because then someone at the Blackhawks organization saw that and invited me to come and skate with the Blackhawks at practice. And
I saw you were goalie to professional hockey players.
Yeah, they were out there shooting.
Did they hurt you?
No, they were. I changed in the locker room with them. They knew who I was. And in fact, they asked me if they should hold back. And I said, no, just go out there. Well, when I went out there, they finished their practice, and then they put me in the nets and took some shots. And I think I stopped like the first 12 shots or so. And somebody said, anybody score on this guy yet? And no, when the next guy ripped a shot past me. So I think they were holding back a little bit. But that led to an invitation then to skate with the Columbus Blue Jackets in Columbus, Ohio.
Wow.
And in that case, the players didn't know who I was. And after the practice, there was a reporter there and asked one of the players how he liked shooting at the bishop. And he said, well, what bishop? What are you talking about? The reporter said, well, the other goalie down there was a bishop. He said, we didn't know that. We're just shooting away at him. So it was good for getting my adrenaline going.
That's a great story. In addition to hockey, you're also a runner. You've done 20-some marathons, and you've raised almost $500,000 for
Right.
charity doing that. Talk about the importance. You mentioned sports and faith. How have those two things come together for you? Why are sports an important part, a continuingly important part of your life?
Well, I got into running really for health reasons. So 3 of my grandparents died in their 50s before I was born from heart disease. And when I was in high school and college, I started to read about the cardiovascular benefits of aerobic training. So I thought, well, if I want to live past 55, I better do some running or bicycling or something like that. So I just started running, a mile up to 3 miles, something like that. And eventually I got the bug to try to do a marathon. And then running took on a life of its own as I got into marathon running. I've done 22 marathons now.
Wow.
I first started running when I was living at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, and I started raising money. I remember the very first donation I got was a parishioner at Holy Name Cathedral gave me the pledge form. He wrote on the pledge form $100 a mile. And I thought, well, maybe he means $100 total. Well, he had the check attached to it. This is before I even ran. There's a check for $2,600. And I was raising money for Mercy Home for Boys and Girls in Chicago. So I thought, well, I've got to run now because I'm not giving this check back. And so since that time, I've used the marathon running as a way to raise money for different causes, like the Chicago Legal Clinic, or now here in Springfield, we have Catholic Charities Legal Services. So like my last couple of marathons, I've raised almost $30,000 on each one. So I'm doing better than $1,000 a mile on a 26-mile run. So
That's amazing.
that keeps me going. That inspires me.
So obviously you weren't always a bishop. You weren't always a priest.
Right.
Talk a little bit about your faith journey, and particularly the process that led to your discernment to pursue the priesthood.
Well, that journey started for me at a very young age. I wanted to be a priest for as long as I can remember. My mother says I was about 4 years old when I started talking about wanting to be a priest. I used to play Mass as a boy. My brothers would serve for me. My sister would dress up as a nun, and I had my own pretend parish. It was Sacred Heart Parish. So then when I got to be old enough to be an altar server, I used to serve at our parish church, which was just a block away. And I had great role models. My parents were very religious, and they knew a lot of priests. In fact, my dad had been in the seminary before he decided to leave and go into pharmacy. And so I grew up knowing a lot of priests who were very good role models. And at that age, it's like, well, I want to be like that when I grow up. So I actually went to a high school seminary in Chicago. We used to have 2 of them. I went to Quigley South. We had Quigley North and Quigley South. I went to the one on the south side.
I was at Quigley North.
You went to Quigley.
Bitter rivals.
Yes. And then I went to the college seminary, Niles College of Loyola University, and then to Mundelein. So I'm what they call the lifer. I went all the way through high school, through ordination. I was ordained at the age of 25. And then I did something rather unusual. When I was in the seminary, I got interested in questions of social justice and trying to help the poor. And I decided I wanted to make that a big focus of my ministry, but I didn't want to just talk about it. I wanted to put something into practice. So I decided to go to law school. So as a priest, I was assigned to St. Michael's Parish in South Chicago, where the steel mills used to be. And as a parish priest, I went to DePaul University College of Law, and I got a civil law degree. And I did that. My idea was I would be a parish priest and have this special project. I helped to co-found the Chicago Legal Clinic. We were providing legal services for the poor. It's still going today. When I was helping out with that more directly, I used to do immigration law. We had a lot of immigrants in that area. And Cardinal Bernardine let me do that for a couple of years. And then he asked me to help at the Chancery Office of the Archdiocese. And then after doing that for a couple more years, he said, well, you're doing more canon law than civil law. So he sent me to Rome to get a canon law degree. So that kind of moved me in a whole different direction of getting more involved in canon law. And so when I came back from Rome with my degree, he made me Chancellor of the Archdiocese. And so I worked with Cardinal Bernardine until he died in 1996, and then with Cardinal George when he came. So it's been an interesting journey of the priesthood, and the law has been a big part of that. And then this whole other dimension of sports, which has started out sort of as a hobby, but I've gotten into that more in the sports world. Also been invited to be part of a group called Catholic Athletes for Christ, and I'm the chairman of the Episcopal Advisory Board with that. So that's been another whole dimension of my ministry because, in our world today, young people especially are so attracted to sports. And some of them play sports and they like to go to sporting events. And I've kind of used the model suggested by St. Ignatius of Loyola when he said in terms of being a missionary, the Jesuits originally started out as a missionary community. Now they're no more in the United States for a lot of their academic work. But as a missionary, he said you should go in through people's door, wherever they're at, and then try to bring them out through the door of faith. So for a lot of people, especially young people, their world is sports. So if you want to connect with them, you got to get into their world of sports and then try to make that connection in the world of sports, try to bring them into the life of faith. And that applies to any walk of life. Whatever your job is, your family, the faith should be an integral part that's worked into all of that.
Yeah. The church often comes under attack. And unlike some other bishops, you've been willing to stand up and speak for the beliefs of the church, particularly in the area of abortion and reproductive rights, when the former administration, through executive order, mandated that all institutions, even Catholic institutions, had to provide contraceptive coverage. You spoke out against that. Some people say that we're too obsessed with issues like abortion. What's your take on those concerns?
Well, sometimes I find myself surprised that people find this to be extraordinary. I have people come up to me and say, well, thank you for your courageous stand. And I don't go into it thinking I'm going to do something courageous here. I go into it thinking this is what the church teaches and these are the moral truths and I should stand up for them. And so sometimes I say things that I think are just kind of matter-of-fact statements of what we believe and then get these reactions to them. But I think that so for me, describing my religious background, going back to my childhood, it's so natural for me to do this that I don't necessarily even think about, I'm going to get up and make some bold proclamation. It kind of flows from who I am.
Yeah. You've also said that if we ever got to the point, and Cardinal George often used to address these kinds of things, where, say, the government said Catholic hospitals had to perform abortions, you said we would simply have to close those hospitals. What would be your response to someone who said, well, why would you close a hospital that's doing so much charitable work?
Well, I would say it would be a shame if it came to that, but I would say we have to, the very principles that motivate us to help the poor are also the principles that guide our faith. Yeah. And if we start compromising on what we stand for in terms of the faith, well then we shouldn't even be doing this. I mean, there are people, the secular government can provide these services, but ours is faith-based. And so if we start cutting back on what the faith is involved with, then I think we're heading down a very dangerous path. So there are unfortunate consequences, like here in Illinois, when Illinois back in 2010 went first with the civil unions and then eventually became same-sex marriage. We were told by the state of Illinois that our Catholic charities, not just here in Springfield but throughout the state, had to do placements with same-sex couples. And we said, no, we can't do that. That violates our
Placement of children.
Placement of children with same-sex couples for foster care and adoption services. And we said, no, we can't do that. And the state wound up refusing to contract with us. We lost a $6 million contract, and it's unfortunate because I think the Department of Children and Family Services also lost some very good foster parents in that process.
Yeah.
So they're doing it without our involvement, and I thought it was interesting. Last year there was an article in the paper about DCFS having a hard time finding qualified parents to be foster parents. I thought that was never a complaint when we were doing foster care, but and there was no mention in the article either about Catholic Charities was forced out of this. And if we hadn't been forced out, maybe we would have some very good foster parents. So, but in that case, people would say, well, should we have compromised our beliefs and do that? Well, no, because I think we're also looking out for what's in the best interest of the children, and we thought the best interest of the children would be to be brought up in a stable household with a mother and a father.
Responsibilities that are entrusted to us always come with challenges. As the bishop, as the shepherd of this diocese in Springfield, what's one challenge that you faced, and how are you addressing it?
Well, I think one of the first challenges that I faced and tried to address here was in terms of vocations to the priesthood and religious life. So when I came, we had 11 seminarians studying for our diocese, and so I set out very intentionally to try to address that, to increase the number of seminarians. So I appointed as my vocation director, the priest who was also my master of ceremonies, so that when I would go to a parish for confirmation, I always told the pastor, I want to meet with the confirmation candidates for about 20 minutes before Mass. And so my vocation director / master of ceremonies and I would meet with the candidates beforehand. We would talk about vocations to the priesthood and the religious life. Then we started doing what we called a series of Andrew dinners.
Oh, yeah.
Named after St. Andrew, who
Yeah.
brought his brother Peter. Yeah. Peter would have never heard about Jesus if it weren't for his brother Andrew. So kind of along that model, we set up these dinners where I would ask a pastor to invite a young man to dinner with me. And so we would have a group of young men with their pastors, and we would talk about priesthood. And so I do that every other year in the fall. And those efforts have, I believe, borne some fruit through God's grace. We've doubled the number of seminarians from 11. We now have 22 seminarians, so very pleased with that. I think the one that's a little bit more challenging is in terms of women to religious life.
Yeah.
We do have some wonderful communities here in our diocese here in Springfield. We have the Springfield Dominican Sisters and the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis. The Springfield Dominican Sisters have Sacred Heart Griffin High School, which is right next door here, and the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis have a system they call Hospital Sisters Health System. They have 13 hospitals in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. And then there's a community in the Alton area near St. Louis called the Sisters of St. Francis of the Martyr St. George. And so they're doing their vocation outreach, and we try to work with them. But on the side of seminarians, I'm just very pleased with the way that's been going. Not only that we've increased the numbers, but the quality of seminaries. We've got some very, very fine candidates studying for the priesthood, and so that's encouraging to me. And I think as the people of the diocese meet our seminarians, they're also very encouraged that we do have priests that for the future.
Yeah. Sometimes through just a sentence or through a powerful witness, people make a lasting impact on us. Who could you name who did that for you?
Well, I would name, first of all, I'd start with some of the priests that I knew. So there was a priest that was a friend of my mother's. Now, my mother, she's got an interesting story as well, because her parents were Catholic, but they never got around to getting her baptized. Oh. And so when she was 13, she and her younger brother, my Uncle Eugene, when he was 9, they went on their own initiative to the rectory and asked to be prepared for baptism. And the priest that prepared my mother for baptism was a priest by the name of Father Stanley Rokaczynski, and we called him Father Rocky for short. And Father Rocky would come over, visit our home. Sometimes we would go to his parish and visit him, and I think he was my first role model as a priest. I wanted to be like Father Rocky. He was a very good priest. And then some of the parish priests, the pastor, Father Theodore Kazarowski, he was a very good role model for me. And then when I was in the seminary, there were lots of, very good priests, like Archbishop Kelleher. He was on the faculty at the college seminary, then in Mundelein, and eventually became Archbishop of Kansas City, Kansas. Monsignor John Canary was another very important role model for me. So a lot of priests like that along the way. And then I'd say maybe at a higher level, probably the bishop that had the most impact on me was actually the Pope John Paul II. So he was named Pope in 1978, which was the year that I was ordained a priest. So from almost the very beginning, I was ordained in May and he became Pope in October. So almost all of my priesthood until he died in 2005 was under the pontificate of John Paul II. And I, as a student in Rome, I had, and then even later as auxiliary bishop, I had the opportunity to meet with him several times, one-on-one, and reading his writings, having been able to meet him, he just was a great role model for me. So I could say I actually met a canonized saint. I've actually met two canonized saints.
Who was the other?
St. Teresa of Calcutta.
Oh, you did meet her.
I did meet her. I used to say Mass, again, when I was doing my graduate studies as a priest in Rome. I used to say Mass about once a month for the Missionary Sisters of Charity. At their convent was called San Gregorio, which was behind the Colosseum. And it was on Saturday mornings at 6:30. So I would walk from the Casa Santa Maria, which was near the Trevi Fountain, over past the Colosseum, over to their convent. And at 6:30, 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, nobody would be out there, and because I had all of this to myself in a sense. But then I would say Mass for this community, very simple. The sisters wearing their white habits with the blue trim, very famous icon in a sense. And but they were very simple. They would sit barefoot on the floor of just a big room where they had an altar set up. And so one time I'm celebrating Mass there. It was all in English. Most of them were from India. But I was celebrating Mass there, and I see this little figure huddled next to a potbelly stove in the back of the room. And I'm looking like, that's Mother Teresa. So I finished Mass, and I came into the sacristy to take off my vestments, and Mother Teresa came into the sacristy and thanked me for being the celebrant for the Mass. Unfortunately, it was before we had cell phones, so I don't have a selfie with Mother Teresa.
No selfie. Well, but that's an incredible memory.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, praise God. Getting to where you are today, obviously, is like everybody else's journey, lots of ups and lots of downs. We tend to think that bishops live this very idyllic kind of life, and that they're insulated from the normal pains and sorrows of everyday life. I'm sure that's not the case. Could you talk about a challenging experience in your life, a difficulty that you had to overcome, and the role that faith played in your getting past that difficulty?
Yes, I think what I would say is probably when I was Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Chicago, Cardinal Bernardine appointed me to be Chancellor in 1992, and it was shortly after I was appointed Chancellor that he established a commission to write policies and procedures for clerical sexual misconduct with minors, and he appointed me to that commission. So, and then after we set up the review board and we had the policies in place, he made me his delegate to the review board, which I did again until he died and continued under Cardinal George. So for it was a total of 10 years, I was the Cardinal's delegate to our diocesan review board, which handled allegations of clerical sexual misconduct with minors. And that was a very challenging time for me because, prior to that, I had never had any experience with even hearing about allegations. And as I said, when I was as a young boy, priests were great role models for me. And so to be then in charge of handling, the darker side of some of these issues that were confronting the church at that point, that was spiritually very challenging. And I think what, for me, it was really kind of seeing the face of evil and the realization that evil is quite real. It's not just a metaphor, but evil exists, and so to try to deal with that. So I think that although it was difficult to work through all that, and we're still continuing to deal with cases today, thankfully not as many as we had in the past, but and I also think that our policies and the steps we've taken and safe environment programs and trying to provide child protection, background checks and things like that, I think we've done a lot, probably more than most other organizations in this. So I think we've made some great strides, but I think it's something that we continue to work through and that I've learned a lot about.
Yeah. Obviously, your life is very full. Tell us as we draw our interview to a conclusion, what's the most joyful dimension of your ministry as the shepherd of this diocese?
The most joyful dimension, I think, would be the ordination of priests. I love ordaining priests. It's very moving. for me, because not only is it seeing someone make this commitment and saying yes to God's call, but the seminarians, I meet them from day one. So they apply, and we have a screening committee, but they meet with me as well. And then I try to visit them in the seminary and exchange emails with them. And so I try to keep in touch with them. So by the time it comes to their ordination, I tell them they're my spiritual sons. And I want them to see me as their spiritual father, and to really have that relationship with them. So an ordination in that sense, it's more than, as much as a parent might enjoy graduation or something like that. For me, it's very spiritually profound, because it's seeing someone make a sacrifice out of love for God. It's answering a need that our people have this great hunger and thirst to have priests in their parishes. So it's answering that need. But there's also this kind of personal dimension to it that's very satisfying.
I can understand why it would be. Whenever I've attended ordinations in the Archdiocese of Chicago, the moment when all the priests move from candidate to candidate and lay hands on him always moves me to tears, never fails. Yeah, it's very powerful. Well, we're just grateful that you've given us this time, that you've given us this little bit of insight into the life of one of our shepherds. And we want to assure you of our prayers for your continued ministry to the people of Springfield.
Thank you, and I'll keep you and all of our viewers in my prayers as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We've met a man who's one of the shepherds in the church, born into a large family on the south side of Chicago, who developed a passion for sports, running and hockey, who also developed a passion for caring for the poor and turned to the law, both civil and canon, in order to be of assistance to those in need, and who now is one of God's shepherds, leading this church to follow the will of God. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you the next time.
To all of the viewers of Shalom TV throughout the world, I want to encourage you not only to support this amazing media apostolate, but to spread the word to others. We all know how the internet and mass media are polluting the world with the poison of pornography and so much other forms of materialism. This is the source of eternal life, the gospel, and Shalom TV is consecrated to spreading the word of Christ. Thank you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.